On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, 90-year-old Harold Brooks was making his usual walk to the bakery, the kind of routine that gave shape to his quiet days. A retired master gunnery sergeant who had served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, Harold wore his years like medals, visible in his slow gait, his weathered face, and the steady grip on his wooden cane. He had faced bullets, bombs, and battlefields with unwavering courage. But nothing prepared him for what would happen just steps from the bakery he loved. As he approached the narrow sidewalk, a group of teenagers, 4 or 5 boys loud and idle, blocked the path. Harold, ever the gentleman, asked kindly for passage. "Could I trouble you, gentlemen?" he said, his voice calm despite the disrespect he sensed. The response was instant and cruel. "This is our bench, Grandpa. Find another way," one snapped, stretching his legs further across the walkway. Then with a smirk, he extended his foot and shoved Harold hard. The old Marine stumbled into traffic. Horns blared. A car swerved. Laughter followed. But what the boys didn't know was that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Behind the faded green door of a modest apartment on Maple Street lived a man who had once faced the fiercest battlegrounds of modern history. Harold Brooks wasn't known by many in the neighborhood, and that suited him just fine. He wasn't one for attention, nor did he seek recognition. But inside that quiet space, every corner whispered a story, a legacy of valor that few could comprehend. Harold had enlisted in the United States Marine Corps at just 16, lying about his age to fight in World War II. What started as youthful defiance turned into a lifelong devotion. He would go on to serve through the Korean War and into the heart of the Vietnam conflict before retiring as a master gunnery sergeant. The decades had weathered his body. His knees ached, his back stiffened with each passing year. But his posture remained proud and his gaze clear and steady. The apartment walls were lined with carefully arranged memorabilia. A black and white photo of his squad in Korea, a folded American flag in a glass case, a shadow box filled with service medals and campaign ribbons, tokens of sacrifice he never displayed in public, but kept close as silent tributes to the fallen. His most cherished item, however, was a worn letter from a friend who never made it home, yellowed with age but read often. Though his service record was heroic, Harold lived simply. He began each day with strong coffee, followed by a slow walk to the park or library. Thursdays were special, his one indulgence, a fresh eclair from the bakery on the corner. That small routine gave rhythm to his life, a gentle reminder of peace after years of chaos. He never asked for much, not a parade, not a plaque, just respect, a kind word, a nod of recognition. But the world, he had learned, moved fast, too fast. And in its rush, it often forgot the shoulders it stood on. So when Harold encountered that group of teenagers blocking the sidewalk that day, he didn't expect trouble. He thought perhaps a word, an old Marine's respectful request, would be enough. He underestimated how easily some forget. He had seen the worst of war, but the disregard in that young man's eyes, it stung differently, deeper, because for all that Harold had given, his youth, his blood, his brothers in arms, what he asked in return was so little. And yet even that was denied. Harold Brooks stood at the edge of the curb, one hand gripping the cane that had slipped from his grasp just moments earlier, the other trembling ever so slightly as he adjusted his balance. His hip throbbed from the jolt, and though no bones were broken, something within him had been cracked, a quiet dignity bruised by laughter and cruelty. The young woman who helped him was kind, her voice laced with concern and outrage. But Harold barely heard her words. The sound that lingered was the cackling laughter of the teenagers fading into the distance. He had seen the face of the enemy before, many times, in many lands. But never had he seen it look so familiar, so American. These boys hadn't fired weapons, but their disrespect struck like shrapnel. He could have turned around and gone home. Most men his age would have, but Harold wasn't most men. He was a Marine, and Marines don't walk away from disrespect. Not to the flag, not to their brothers, and certainly not to the legacy they left in the mud and fire of war. As he stood collecting himself, his mind became sharp with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't going to chase after those boys. His fighting days were behind him, but there were other ways, A Marine's Way. Harold knew that alley. The one the teens had disappeared into led to a dead end behind a long-abandoned warehouse. And he also knew that just 2 blocks away stood the local Marine Corps recruiting station. The man in charge there, Gunnery Sergeant Mason, was no stranger to Harold. They'd met once at a VFW ceremony, younger, tougher, full of that modern Marine fire. But beneath that muscle and strict tone was something Harold recognized instantly: loyalty. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his old flip phone, the kind with a scratched screen and buttons that barely clicked anymore. His fingers shook as he dialed the station number, but not from fear, from resolve. "Sergeant Peterson," he said when the line picked up. "This is Master Gunnery Sergeant Harold Brooks, retired. I need to speak with Gunny Mason. It's urgent. Concerning disrespect toward a Marine, an assault." There was a pause followed by a sharp professional response. "Yes, Master Gunny. One moment." As the call was transferred, Harold looked down the street, not with anger, but with clarity. He wasn't seeking revenge. He was defending something sacred. And the Corps? The Corps always answered the call. Less than 10 minutes after the call, the quiet of the small street was broken, not by sirens or chaos, but by the synchronized rhythm of military boots hitting the pavement. Harold Brooks sat quietly on a bench nearby, eyes locked on the alley where the teenagers had disappeared minutes earlier. And then he saw them. Gunnery Sergeant Mason led a squad of 8 Marines, some in crisp service Charlies, others in rugged utility uniforms, likely pulled straight from duty. They didn't shout, didn't posture. They simply moved with the kind of presence that made people stop and look. Disciplined, silent, and powerful. As they reached the alley's mouth, Gunny Mason raised his hand. 2 Marines broke off and stood guard at the entrance. The remaining 6 followed him into the dim, narrow corridor. There were no flashing lights, no confrontations, just that palpable aura. These were United States Marines, and they didn't come to negotiate. Harold couldn't see what happened inside the alley, but he could hear. The teenage laughter that had filled the street only moments before was gone, replaced by a heavy silence. Then came Gunny Mason's voice, calm, commanding, and utterly immovable. It was the voice of a man who'd forged warriors from boys, the voice that carried not volume, but authority. No scuffles, no raised fists, just words. Words sharpened by decades of discipline, laced with honor, and reinforced by legacy. And for those boys, those words would land harder than any punch ever could. Just minutes later, the teenagers began to emerge. But they weren't the same boys who had swaggered in, smirking and full of themselves. No, these were 5 pale, visibly shaken kids, their faces stripped of color, their bravado reduced to fear. One of them stumbled slightly as he walked, his legs barely steady. Another kept his head down, avoiding all eye contact. They didn't speak. They didn't glance at Harold. They just slipped away as fast as their trembling feet could carry them, silent, humbled, and changed. The pride they had carried like armor had shattered. Whatever happened inside that alley wasn't physical. It was transformational. They hadn't been yelled at out of rage, but spoken to with the weight of sacred disappointment. Soon after, Gunny Mason and his men stepped back into the daylight. Their faces were unreadable, cold as steel, but touched with a faint satisfaction. Justice, in its truest form, had been delivered. As Gunny approached, Harold stood. Without a word, Mason offered a perfect salute, and Harold, steady and dignified, returned it with quiet pride. As the boys disappeared down the street, an eerie stillness settled over the block. It was as if the world had paused to absorb what had just occurred. The laughter, the mockery, all of it had evaporated. In its place was an air of reverence, of quiet reflection. Gunny Mason walked up to Harold. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Brooks, sir," he said firmly. "The situation has been addressed. Those young men have received a thorough re-education on the core values of the Corps: honor, courage, and commitment, especially regarding respect for those who came before them." Harold nodded and returned the salute. "Thank you, Gunny, and thank your Marines for me." "There's no thanks needed, sir. This is our duty," Mason replied, his eyes still hard but sincere. "We protect the honor of those who built the foundation we stand on, and we never tolerate disrespect toward that legacy." From that day on, the neighborhood changed. The boys who once loitered with arrogance became models of humility. They held doors open for the elderly, nodded at veterans, and crossed streets to help with groceries. No one knew what exactly had been said in that alley, but everyone knew it had worked. Harold kept walking his familiar route, and from that day forward, every time he passed the Marine recruiting station, a young guard saluted him. And he always returned the gesture with calm, steady pride. For the first time in years, Harold didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel like a forgotten old man. He felt like a Marine again. The following week, Harold made his usual trip to the bakery. With a lighter step and a steadier heart, he bought his eclair and took a seat on the same bench where it had all begun. The street felt different now, clearer, calmer, almost sacred. And when a group of teenagers passed by, they nodded respectfully. This time, not out of fear, but understanding. The story of the alley and the Marines spread quickly. No one shared exact details, but everyone sensed the shift. The once defiant boys were now quiet, helpful, and courteous. A silent transformation had taken place, one that reminded the town of the values it had almost forgotten. Harold didn't need medals anymore. What he received that day was far greater: acknowledgement, respect, and the warm reassurance that he was never alone. The Marine Corps had his back, always. In a world that often forgets its past, we must remember those who paved the way. Veterans like Harold aren't just old men on benches. They are the living reminders of sacrifice, strength, and the price of peace. Honor doesn't age, and it must never be ignored. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your gratitude, or your own story. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because some values must never fade.